Welcome back to Season 5 of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm happy to go on this journey with you. We are recording this episode on the eve of the key summit meeting in Doha on August 15th. This summit is a last-ditch effort by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar to advance a hostage-for-ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, though Hamas said it would not take part in the new round of talks. Iran and Hezbollah are still making preparations for potential retaliation against Israel after the recent assassination of a top Hezbollah military commander, Fuad Shukr, in Beirut, and Hamas's political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran. The retaliatory strikes by Iran and Hezbollah threaten to tip the Middle East into regional war. The U.S. and its allies are desperately trying to avoid this outcome, prompting a flurry of diplomatic and military efforts to stave off escalation. In recent days, Washington has bolstered its regional military presence in a muscled show of force to Iran and its proxies. Defense Secretary Austin has sent a new aircraft carrier to the region, another squadron of fighter jets, and most recently a nuclear-powered missile-guided submarine. And it should also be pointed out the United States has also announced $20 billion in military aid to Israel, just at this key juncture. Iran has recently signaled that a breakthrough in ceasefire negotiations could delay its attack on Israel. It remains uncertain how Hezbollah will take its cues from Iran on how and when to retaliate, and if their attacks between Tehran and Beirut will be coordinated. This moment of crisis will put the U.S. Israel security relationship to the test. Washington's show of force in the region is a sign to the Israelis the U.S. has Israel's back in the face of an attack, but it's also a message to regional adversaries that the U.S. is prepared to act upon contingent scenarios. However, there could be both U.S.-Israel bilateral implications and U.S. regional implications if indeed the hostage-for-ceasefire talks fail to produce a breakthrough. What does this current crisis moment tell us about the U.S.-Israel security relationship? To what extent are Israel's security and U.S. regional interests interdependent? For this urgent conversation, I'm delighted to be joined on today's podcast by two excellent guests, Dana Stroul and Amos Gilead. Dana is the Washington Institute's Director of Research and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, the Pentagon's top civilian official with responsibility for the region. Amos is the Executive Director of the Institute for Policy and Strategy at Reichman University, and he's the former head of research for the IDF Military Intelligence and Director of Policy and Political Military Affairs at Israel's Ministry of Defense. These are two people who could really speak with great depth about U.S.-Israel security relationship and how they both view the Middle East at a time of crisis. I'm so delighted to have you both joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
We're taping this in the middle of a crisis, and I think however this crisis unfolds, it's always important to learn from the past, and the very recent past, I want to say. April 13th, 14th, a dramatic day in the history of the Middle East, certainly in the history of the U.S.-Israel security relationship. It seemed like something out of a Star Wars movie that here the United States and Israel with CENTCOM really worked together to put together this unprecedented coalition with Britain, with France, with Jordan on some capacity, Saudi Arabia in some capacity. To watch this all unfold was just remarkable to see. Some people believe it's a glimpse into what the Middle East could be in terms of the U.S.-Israel relationship, about moderate forces in the region who seek stability arrayed against Iran and some of its proxies who seek to destabilize the region. Just looking at this crisis now, what are the lessons that we learn from that April 13th, 14th period?
It's a really important question. And I worry actually that we are so in the moment of crisis response across the Middle East in this post-October 7th strategic environment that we haven't sufficiently wrestled with and extracted the lessons learned and what the takeaways are for the future of both how we think about Iran's threats and how we think about combating them together with allies and partners. So I'm really glad you're taking time in your podcast to reflect on this. So let me put out a few key lines and then I'll say something about each of them. The first is it's simply a watershed moment that Iran abandoned its decades-long approach of seeking to destabilize the region and exert its own coercive leverage through terrorists and non-state actors, proxy groups, this Iranian terrorist network. On April 13th, Iran abandoned that process and launched a direct attack on Israel. And not only that, all of this work projecting power through non-state groups, terrorists, and proxies that we've been wrestling with and increasing cooperation with Israel to undermine and combat. Normally, Iran does not claim responsibility. It doesn't say, I funded that, I provided the weapons, I directed it. It maintains this veneer of what we in Washington call plausible deniability. What was remarkable about April 13th is that there was a total change of approach here, with Iranian senior leaders publicly telegraphing exactly what they were going to do, giving everybody else almost 2 weeks to prepare to defend against that attack. Number two is that it failed. So we saw the most extensive missile attack by one state on another state that I can think of in recent history, over 300 attack drones, plus ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. And generally, one of the concerns that military planners have when we think about using force against Iran is what the Iranian retaliatory action will look like. And here we actually saw the Iranian retaliatory action, and it was demonstrated over the course of April 13th to April 14th that one can actually, with effective equipment, intelligence sharing, and political will, intercept and defeat a complex Iranian attack. So first of all, that it happened at all, a state-on-state attack claimed by Iran and the leaders in Tehran. Number two, that it failed. Number three is the absolutely remarkable multilateral security cooperation that we saw put together by the United States. I think it's important to recognize that this didn't just happen organically in a 2-week period when the Iranians said, we're going to directly attack Israel. This is actually proof of concept on work that has been a U.S. priority for multiple administrations. Even in the George W. Bush administration, there were efforts to better integrate Arab partners across the region. In the Obama administration, there was the Camp David Summit, work to integrate and provide reassurance through multilateral security cooperation, especially after the Obama administration entered into the Iran nuclear deal, which received a lot of criticism from the region. In the Trump administration, it was called the Mesa Alliance, again, working on this multilateral security architecture. And in the Biden administration, especially when Israel entered into the U.S. military command responsible for the Middle East, so CENTCOM or U.S. Central Command, this team has put operational integration on steroids and made it a top priority and worked to demonstrate that by sharing air defense radars, intelligence, aligning acquisition of missile defense systems, and working not only with the United States bilaterally, but in a multilateral fashion, security for all, that collective defense imperative, is more effective than anything we can do on a unilateral or bilateral basis. And that is exactly what was demonstrated on April 13th. And I think that proof of concept was remarkable and opened up more space to deepen and increase that multilateral security cooperation. And the final takeaway from April 13th is that the U.S. role in the Middle East remains indispensable. There is no other country that could have brought together Europeans, Arabs, and Israel all working in such a coordinated fashion, receiving intelligence, pushing it back out, orchestrating who was going to take down which element of the Iranian attack, plus some just exceptional coordinated public messaging and diplomacy. All of these, to me, are key elements about how we think about restoring stability to the region going forward. There's a lot of talk about what China's doing in the region, what Russia's doing in the region, what Iran seeks to do in the region. I think it's quite clear now that even if there's frustration with the United States, there is no other government and no other leadership that has this convening power and the competitive edge of military capability and technological advantage to create this kind of coalition. Number two, the architecture exists to deepen that multilateral security cooperation. So if there's political will, and given the fact that Tehran is signaling it's going to continue to arm these non-state actors, it's going to continue to proliferate missiles and attack drones, the imperative to continue increasing this cooperation, I think, is more than clear. And then just reflecting on the moment we're at now, clearly April 13th wasn't an anomaly. I think every country who has an interest in not having regional war needs to ponder what it means for Tehran's knee-jerk reaction now to be, we're going to launch a direct attack on another state. That is not how wars have been fought in recent years in the Middle East. And to think about every time there's some escalation, the Iranians are going to threaten to directly attack Israel is a terrible security conundrum that we will need to wrestle with going forward.
For our listeners, we say April 13th, 14th because of the time difference. In the U.S., it's called April 13th. In Israel, it's also April 14th. Almost, to what extent is this a necessity or a luxury for Israel? As you ponder these takeaways from April, this was unprecedented. As Dana said, it was the first time that Iran attacked Israel directly, not through deniable proxies at arm's distance. This was also not a pro forma symbolic at one or two here, all different types, drones, surface-to-surface, cruise missiles, the U.S. Israel cooperation on things like the Arrow, 1, 2, and 3. This went on for years, and you were so much a part of that. But I guess this issue of what does it mean to you, and what do we learn the lessons going forward, and can Israel do without this coalition?
I think it's really historic event, the mid-April attack by Iran, because this is the first time, as you have said, both of you, that the Islamic Republic of Iran has launched direct military attack on Israel in order to hurt and to destroy strategic bases or base of the Israeli Air Force. Now, first of all, Iran is the main threat to Israel. The Islamic Republic of Iran is the main threat to the stability of the Middle East. Iran does have achievement by having alliance with Russia. It's very important for the future. The fact that they have crossed the Rubicon and attacked Israel widely, it means they might do it again, maybe this week, next week, I don't know. Why it's so important? Because we need strategy. Iran is the main threat to the future of Israel, the national security of Israel, and the vision of Khamenei that he is not so old as he used to be, but his heritage, from his point of view, if I reflect well his mind, is that it's feasible to implement the vision of destroying Israel. That's why we need to be worried. However, to be worried, it's not enough. What we need to do? First of all, I think our national security relies on two pillars. Military might, it's very simple, but I need to repeat it, and wisdom. Military might, we need to be strong and to draw the lessons from what happened in 7th of October vis-a-vis intelligence. There is no excuse to it. There is no explanation. It's all fiasco. We must not repeat it. However, the damage has been done. Secondly, we need strategic structure or architecture. I call it Pax Americana. Against all the allegations that the United States is about to leave the Middle East because of China, because other priorities, I don't think there is any way for the United States to leave the Middle East. The Middle East is a disastrous area. You always in the Middle East, you choose between the worst and the worst. Now, we do have unprecedented threat, but we do have unprecedented opportunities. What has been proven during the wide attack, that first we do have the might, we do have the Pax Americana embodied through CENTCOM. CENTCOM is not understood for most people in the world. CENTCOM, it means American leadership of all stable countries like Israel, and all we do belong to the same stable vis-a-vis the unstable like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and so on and so on. And there is a string of Iranian proxies that are eating from inside the legitimate sovereign countries like the beautiful Lebanon, like Yemen, like Iraq, and so on. So we need to belong and to enhance and to cement this alliance. It has been proven fantastically during the attack that technically failed. I'm not sure this is a lesson of Iran that they failed. They failed for sure, but their interpretation for failure is sometimes different from us. I wouldn't be surprised if they will cross the Rubicon one day about the nuclear. There are some publications about it of the opposition of Iran. I'm not sure they are accurate. However, I won't be surprised if they will try to develop secretly unless there is some agreement with the United States that is very feasible. I won't be surprised. Based on my experience, the alliance between Arab countries, United States and Israel is feasible, possible, and essential. What do I mean by that? I mean by that, for example, Jordan, Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, I'm very concerned about the Iranian efforts to undermine the King Abdullah regime and to destroy the strategic depths of Israel. And the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan is one of the pillars of the stability of the Middle East, in spite of the fact they are so poor economically. So altogether, Egypt, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, UAE, all of them, without Muslim brothers in their countries, united secretly at least vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic and vis-a-vis the bloc, Russia, Iran, maybe in the future China, that's the solution. We need to establish strategic alliance. Without this strategic alliance, Iran couldn't fail in such magnitude as they failed. And they know it. That's why even they try again and they will fail again for the same reasons. It means we need to think strategically. The Iranians are trying to develop what I call the firewall against Israel.
The ring of fire.
So altogether, we need to weaken it after the next round that might come very soon, the attacks from the proxies and Iran itself. On one hand, we are living in unprecedented period of threat by Iran. On the other hand, we do have opportunities and lessons from mid-April attack, or maybe in the coming. The last sentence is, what we need now is to adopt the initiative of President Biden, because we do have the option to calm down Gaza and Hezbollah and to release our hostages. If we fail to do it, and we adopt only the absolute victory, whatever it is, I don't understand what does it mean, but maybe there is something behind it, at the expense of strategic alliances, at the expense of the cooperation in the future, at the expense of legitimacy, and we haven't mentioned the Palestinians, we might face damages.
So let's just stick with Iran. And again, for our listeners who are not aware of CENTCOM, because you've heard reference to it, this is the U.S. military command, as Dana noted. It seems like almost the messianic days where Israel, all of its Arab neighbors that are tied with the United States, are sitting together. They have an integrated air defense sense of things. They're looking at the same screens. They're all in one room operationally. As Dana says, this has become a top priority of the administration and of General Kurilla, the head of CENTCOM, who seemed like he was the conductor of this orchestra in April. Given all this cooperation, how good do you feel is America and Israel's ability to read what's going on in Iran, to read what's going on with Hezbollah? How good is it?
First of all, to reflect on a past experience that has given some insight into how exceptional our abilities are to read the machinations and plannings of these two adversaries. If you remember, during the Trump administration, after the decision to assassinate the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, or IRGC for your listeners, the head of the IRGC, whose name was Qasem Soleimani, who was seen as the strategic visionary and architect of Iran's cultivation of these terrorists and proxies as a way to project power and keep force away from Iran's territory, but a way for Iran to achieve its objectives in a non-conventional sense. So get leverage by destabilizing governments, as Amos talked about, beautiful Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, cultivating all these non-state groups that could challenge the governments and answer to Tehran rather than their own people. That was the vision of Qasem Soleimani. And he was seen as driving really serious threats globally, regionally, against the United States and against Israel. In the previous administration, in the Donald Trump administration, There was a decision that he'd received too many warnings to stand down. He did not, and he was assassinated in Iraq. And after that, there was an expectation that Iran was going to retaliate. And there were multiple comments at the time about the exquisite intelligence and the necessity of U.S. Israeli intelligence sharing that allowed U.S. forces to be prepared for that Iranian retaliatory response. And in fact, what ended up happening is a series of ballistic missiles were sent at U.S. forces at a base inside Iraq. And for the most part, many lives were saved. There was time to prepare. And that was seen both as a remarkable testament to U.S. Israeli security cooperation and intelligence sharing, but also how exceptional our intelligence understanding is. Let me give one more example just to reflect on what this is. So after the July 27th Hezbollah attack on a town in northern Israel, Masd al-Shams, which resulted in the death of 12 children, absolutely tragic, Israel said it was going to respond. And it did in an exceptionally precise operation. It was able to use very specific munitions to target one residential building in downtown Beirut without causing any other collateral damage. And it knew that this Hezbollah second-in-command leader, Fuad Shukr, was going to be there. And then consider that less than 24 hours later, while Israel has not claimed publicly responsibility, is assumed to be responsible for an implanted explosive device in one room of a government guest house, again, the IRGC, an IRGC guest house, that had provided a residence to the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, during the inauguration of the new Iranian president, President Pezeshkian. Again, consider the exceptional intelligence and the penetration of both Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Iranian security apparatus in Iran to execute these kinds of sophisticated operations. And so this gets to the question, how well can we read them? I think that the intelligence game has advanced tremendously, and especially how Israel and the United States work together. The challenge right now, I think, is that we don't know what is going to happen and when it's going to happen because the Iranians haven't made a decision. And Nasrallah, the leader of Lebanese Hezbollah, has also not made a decision. Clearly, there is confusion about when and how to design that response, especially because Hezbollah has said we will stop when there's a Gaza ceasefire, and there appears to be momentum for a summit on August 15th in the Middle East. And the Iranians, since October 7th, have said our escalations are to pressure and punish Israel and to punish the United States for its support of Israel. But what we want is to protect Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and we want a ceasefire in Gaza. So if they attack now, then it looks like they're a spoiler to any diplomatic progress toward a ceasefire. And so that confusion in their system is why we simply don't know what and when to anticipate and prepare to defend against an attack.
There's a messaging issue, too, which is the United States is saying, look, on one hand, we will not flinch from defending our allies if Iran attacks. On the other hand, we don't want a regional war. And we say that 5 times a day. And I think people see us in the world as that truly the United States does not want war. But Iran, they send messages they don't want war either for their own reasons because they're afraid of the vulnerability of their nuclear project. Do you think that there's a certain asymmetry there, that we have to emphasize what we don't want in terms of war, which is laudable, I think, in many ways? But on the other hand, sometimes the message of the Middle East is the superpower is more fearful of war. Now, we know the distinction as us. Of course, we know that distinction. Is there a messaging asymmetry here for the United States in terms of what the Arab and Iranian street hears?
I think it's a really important point, and this messaging asymmetry has produced significant criticism of the Biden administration's approach to what it says it wants right now, which is de-escalation. Before we get to the messaging, though, I think it's important to talk about why the administration doesn't want war. And I would note here that it's not just President Biden that doesn't want war. No Arab government or Arab country wants war. Europeans don't want war, and actually the Chinese don't want war. And there are real reasons why. So for the United States, let's recall, we have 5 air bases in the Middle East, over 30,000 forces in the Middle East. If there is a regional war, these Americans will be targeted. the bases will be targeted, and that could seriously undermine the stability and the security of our partners. In the United Arab Emirates, in Qatar, in Bahrain, we could go on and on and on. Number two, the Middle East, what they would like to be doing right now is growing their very young populations and developing them to compete on a global scale. They are interested in economic prosperity, economic growth, commercial opportunities, etc. War is terrible for business. It's not just the United States. Number three, we have seen multiple civil wars in the Middle East in the past 15 years. What is one of the major implications of what happened? Massive outflows of migrants, people fleeing these wars. And where did they go? To Europe. And it deeply destabilized Europe. We've seen changes in politics. We've seen strains to support these migrants. These are huge factors that affect the U.S. network of allies and partners upon which we rely for our own security and to achieve our objectives on a global scale. So this isn't just about Iran. It's about much more than Iran. But on the messaging, I think it's a very fair criticism that for a long time, the Iranians have perceived that Israel has the will to go to war to protect its interests and its people, but not all of the military capabilities. And the United States has all of the military capabilities, but perhaps not the will. A lot of work between the United States and Israel over the past couple of years has been to close that cognitive space between will and capability. But I think it's fair to say that because the United States has focused so much on preventing regional war, which again is what our partners want to hear, and we have an interest in doing everything possible to prevent war, but the enemy, the adversary, has to believe that we're willing to do it to achieve our interests. So there's been this massive buildup of U.S. military posture in the region. We've sent and accelerated a new aircraft carrier to the region. We've sent a new fighter squadron of F-22s, which is fifth generation capability. We have sent a nuclear-powered guided missile submarine into the Middle East, all in the space of less than 2 weeks. But if the people making the decisions in Tehran believe we're only going to use that in a defensive nature, they probably think that their interests and their regime are safe inside Iran. And that is not going to change or compel different behavior and decision-making by them. And I do think that is a challenge.
Should Iran also realize that it stands to lose its nuclear program? Our colleague Dennis Ross sometimes talks about this. Do you think they need to know that a confrontation with the U.S. puts a lot at risk that they value the most?
I do think that they need to perceive that their nuclear program is at risk, but we also need to be honest that there is no military option that completely eliminates their nuclear program because it's not all about physical infrastructure. It's about knowledge. You cannot bomb and attack your way out of knowledge. Every time there is a cyber attack on aspects of Iran's nuclear program, they learn something and they build it back better and stronger and more protected. So when we think about that military option, very difficult to see how you absolutely obliterate the entire military program. And that's why largely years ago, there was a conclusion that before military force, you try diplomacy. I would also note a very alarming intelligence assessment. So for your listeners on the podcast, here in the United States, our Office of National Intelligence is required to submit regular reports to Congress on key issues. For years now, the U.S. intelligence assessment that they released publicly about Iran's nuclear weapons program is that Iranian senior leaders have not made the political decision to pursue a nuclear weapons device. This week, the intelligence assessment changed and it should be getting more attention than it is right now. And that's because we're focused on Gaza and the ceasefire and whether or not Iran launches another direct attack. But the intelligence assessment this week said Iran is undertaking activities that better position it to develop a nuclear device should it make the political decision to do so. And you combine that with what U.S. administration officials like Secretary of State Tony Blinken have said, which is that the Iranian breakout time period now is about 2 weeks. If they make a political decision, they could have enough weapons-grade uranium for a nuclear weapon in less than 2 weeks. And then there's a very fluid period of time on the other side to actually make that explosive device. But this is something we're not paying enough attention to right now. And to get back to your original question about can we hold a nuclear program at risk, Very tough to do if our allies and partners are not united with us, if they don't share the same intelligence assessment as us, they don't share the same sense of urgency as us, and they believe that diplomatic options have been exhausted here.
We talked about the great notorious mastermind of Iran, Qasem Soleimani, who talked about the ring of fire. Gallant, the defense minister of Israel, says that Israel is facing 7 fronts. And you, who are kind of the architect on the Israeli side of the U.S. Israel security relationship, dealing also with QME, qualitative military edge, and many aspects for decades of the U.S. Israel security relationship. When you have 7 fronts, is that idea that has been so central in the U.S. Israel security relationship, is it still valid the way it was when you used to think about state actors, wars of the past that we saw between 48 and 73? But now we're dealing with these non-state actors, and maybe deterrence is different with them. But can Israel defend itself by itself? Is its defense industry, if it only kind of got into high gear, Elbit, all these other companies, could you do without the American weaponry that you could defend itself by itself?
This allegedly said, what you share with me, by some politicians in Israel, that I am not sure they understand the strategic environment in the Middle East. What we need, at least from my perspective, I was involved in deep cooperation with the United States longer than 4 decades. Even I got the Legion of Merit. I do believe that now it's very clear that Iran, based on what happened in 7th of October, that's my impression about their assessment. They can cross the Rubicon to attack Israel directly. Maybe they will fail next time if they attack Israel. I think they will attack at least Hezbollah. And their strategy, like Dana has mentioned, Qasem Soleimani, his strategy is workable and potentially successful, namely ring of proxies at the expense of legitimate states. The main challenge today, I need to repeat it because it's important, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. I am identifying remarkable efforts by Iran to undermine, to destroy Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, to take over maybe Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, to destabilize the West Bank, and to use the crisis in Gaza. And the proxies like Hezbollah. It seems to me that Nasrallah will attack us. All of them, by the way, Nasrallah, Khamenei, they think that if they attack Israel, it won't lead to comprehensive war and conflict between us and them. If you ask me about what we need to do, first of all, we need to intensify our intel capabilities together to be sure that Iran is not crossing the Rubicon and developing military nuclear weapon. They are very close, as Colin Kahl has said, Blinken has said, and General Milley have said to the Congress. There is difference between 90% enrichment, 2 weeks, and weapon, Milley has said several months. Let's compromise on 1 year. 1 year in history is almost 0. So, altogether, I think we need the strategic cooperation between US and Israel. We need the strategic alliance. That's fantastic. I hope it will continue. That's fantastic. Only few people understand it. You hear something about interception of missiles. It's like Hollywood movies. I mean, that's outcome of wisdom. And there is alliance of air defense and anti-missile defense alliance. That's product of long, intensive dialogues between Israel and the United States, and also taking into consideration, based on bipartisanship, the qualitative military age of Israel that is defined by law. I don't want to go to details. And everything today's announcement by the White House about F-15 and the F-35 that we do have, and maybe we'll have more. I mean, altogether, it's not only military. It's a matter of image. It's a matter of alliance vis-a-vis the new alliance that has been established between Iran and Russia with surprises. Who could imagine that Iran would supply UAVs to Russia to murder Europeans in the middle of Europe? If somebody asked me 10 years ago if it could happen, I would say no. And this is the opposite. So altogether, if you ask me, I'm excluding, as long as we are not becoming stupid, The feasibility is that we will rely only on ourselves. We will never produce the compliments by our military guys, Air Force, about F-35, that is not F-22, that is only in the United States. I mean, the whole American technology with a democratic spirit and with democratic nature, we need to be sure that we are valuable pillar in the strategic alliance led by the United States in the Middle East with not democratic states. I don't believe that we will ever see any democratic state. I used to have differences with the United States during Obama time that he believes that he could change the Middle East. But you cannot change the Middle East. I hope that Israel will stay a democratic, Jewish democratic state. Otherwise, we will lose the shared values with the United States that is so important.
I'm sitting here with two people who really are so deeply versed in the U.S. Israel relationship. But almost in your sense, can Israel fight a war in Lebanon without the United States' blessing when it comes to ammunition and things like that? And we should point out also the United States just announced, in keeping with the aid that had been given in the Congress, the U.S. is releasing like $20 billion in aid. Can Israel fight a war without the U.S.'s blessing in Lebanon, for example?
In Lebanon, I think we can. The image is that we cannot. But based on my acquaintance, and still I think I do have the knowledge, we can handle Hezbollah, I call it. And there are some ideas to destroy also Lebanon. I'm personally against it because if Lebanon is destroyed, it means that if Israel needs to send troops, boots on the ground to Lebanon, it means without alternative we will stay there forever, like we stayed there 20 years. I do believe that the Lebanese structure that is so weak, after Hezbollah is destroyed, it's a matter of time. We are on collision course with them. Even they attack us and we attack them back, there will be some arrangements. I cannot imagine something different. However, one day we will be forced to be in real war with them. I don't know when. It's not so important. It's a technical question. So it's a matter of strategy. Way out. Exit strategy. I do believe that we need to destroy Hezbollah as an integral part of our war against Iran. However, we need to have in Lebanon alternative to the Hezbollah. That's why I'm so much opposed to Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. What they want is to establish military occupation, direct government of Israel on Gaza and West Bank. It will weaken our alliance with the United States, with Jordan, with Arab countries. It will be blow to our face vis-a-vis our need to be part of strategic alliance while being strong in this alliance.
There's a lot of issues that have come up during the Gaza war that people want a better understanding of what's happened. And on one hand, I want you to be able to reflect on the scope of U.S. Israel security relations before October the 7th. But since October the 7th, sometimes people say, well, look, there's misunderstanding. If the United States fast-tracked certain authorization of weapons, and that meant that because the Secretary of State signs a piece of paper, there's no objections of Congress, there's no bureau objections within the building and in the Pentagon and elsewhere. So when you're not at fast track, people think it's a slowdown. But you say, well, that's not the norm. But if we kept fast track on forever since October 7th, we would have had a situation, and as I heard from a very senior member of the administration, a certain senator might put a hold on certain weapons delivery to Israel. If we're not smart about this, it'll bite us. It goes without saying, but it's always worth saying it, even if it goes without saying, what the administration has done since October 7th with the aircraft carriers, with the airlift of weapons that have come to Israel in this extraordinary period. You were in the Pentagon at that time. You know, you can reflect on the drama of the period, and I think sometimes when we get caught up in these points, you know, we can't forget the forest for the trees, and the forest has been remarkable.
There were so many lines of effort in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, and I do think it's important to put it all together to really get the strategic view of what happened. I can say, having been in the Pentagon on October 7th, by October 8th, we knew that Israel was going to need exceptional amounts of security assistance support really, really fast, and that likely what they had in country wasn't going to be sufficient for what they needed to do to militarily dismantle Hamas. So the first thing we did was look at how the United States and its allies in Europe had provided security assistance to Ukraine. And actually, the way it happened in Ukraine was not the typical way that we do for Israel, which is Israel and the Defense Department and the State Department figure out what Israel needs. We look at the amount of funding it gets every year, which right now, before the National Security Supplemental, was $3.3 billion a year. We talk about Israel's medium and long-term vision for its military and then what those purchases are going to be. Then it gets notified to Congress, then it gets announced, and then it goes to U.S. defense industry. And then years later, something gets delivered. That wasn't going to work for the Gaza situation. And it wasn't going to work for Ukraine, given the urgency of Ukraine. So in the Ukraine context, there's actually a really elaborate system across all the services of the U.S. military, Army, Navy, Air Force, etc., and our acquisition experts, and our weapons experts, and our military transfers experts, and the military experts on the ground who are looking at the conflict, thinking through what Ukraine needs. Ukraine is talking to them. So we've talked a lot about CENTCOM in Europe. There's something called European Command EUCOM. We go through a whole system. Then there's a decision about what could be made available for Ukraine, and we take it out of U.S. military stock. So it's actually U.S. military warehouses that have been opened up for Ukraine for years now. So in the Israel context, all of us working on Israel looked at the Ukraine model and we said, okay, we're going to take that, but we're going to put it on steroids and fast track it. And by October 8th, that is exactly what we were doing. We took the Ukraine process, we took the structure, and rather than months, we collapsed it to days. And we were working in the most exceptional open communication I have seen with CENTCOM and any partner to figure out what the IDF needed and then figure out where the U.S. military had it in stock. And then what was the fastest way to get it to Israel? Is it a ship? Is it a plane? Working with the IDF, how are you going to get it off these ships or these planes? So this was just an exceptional amount of coordination. And I say that because, yes, there have been specific cases where specific munitions have been slowed down, but that does miss the forest for the trees in terms of the exceptional amount. And then I should also say we're now entering month 11 of the Gaza campaign, and we're in year 3 of the U.S. support to Ukraine. There's new production, which is what was announced here in Washington this week. So the F-15s, this obviously isn't coming out of U.S. Air Force closets. This is new production. It's not going to have an impact on the Gaza war now, but it is a strategic signal that the United States is going to have Israel's back and continue providing the best weapons, munitions, and defense platforms in the world to Israel for years and decades to come. And the timing is not a coincidence. That's for the leaders in Tehran to understand there's not daylight on Israel's security and defense. I do think it's important to think about the human lives involved here. I actually went with Secretary of Defense Austin to visit the crew, the Navy crew on the USS Ford in December of last year. Those sailors were extended multiple times to stay in the Eastern Mediterranean because the situation was so dynamic and alarming, and because we wanted to make it very clear to Iran and Hezbollah that we have massive capability right off your coast, and we're prepared to use it to support Israel's defense, so don't escalate, the famous Biden contraction, don't. But when we got on that ship, one of the sailors on the ship asked me what I did for my job, and I explained what my job was, and he said, "Oh, so you're part of the decision to keep us here." I almost got home to see my family for Christmas. It was exceptional to think about the decisions we've made that affect real human lives to support Israel and to try to prevent that big regional war. When the question comes to whether or not Israel could do a war in Lebanon without an American blessing, I think the questions are for how long and what does that look like? Because Israel now has needed U.S. resupply for 10 months. And one of the reasons that you see the administration working really, really fast to obligate some of the military aid that was in this big $14.3 billion supplemental for Israel. And now on these packages, some of it is strategic signaling. Nobody should think there's daylight between Washington and Jerusalem. But on the other hand, Some of the billions of dollars of funding that were announced is because Israel does need resupply. And I think any expectation that war in Lebanon could be limited, we now have seen several times that what we thought was going to happen in Gaza didn't actually happen. Let me also just reflect on what we've learned about the IDF and U.S. military relationship post-October 7th. What our military leaders will say, and I think it's very important and was extremely educational for me, because I would ask them, if you were designing a campaign in Gaza, would it look like what the IDF have done? And what our military leaders would say to me is, we never had to design a campaign like Gaza. And even when we were trying to take out a terrorist organization in a densely populated area, and for them, the most recent example is the Defeat ISIS operation in Iraq, when we had to dislodge ISIS from Mosul, they had 7 months to prepare for that conflict, that operational war in Mosul, and they were able to evacuate or warn civilians to get out of Mosul. The IDF have not had those operational opportunities in Gaza, and we're dealing with an enemy who believes that it wins when civilians die, and that's what you see on the evening news. When you have an enemy who has entrenched itself so significantly in the civilian infrastructure of the area, and the IDF has terrible decisions to make every day about how to mitigate civilian harm and minimize collateral damage and civilian casualties, but dismantle Hamas. So I think the United States, from a military perspective, believes that the IDF have taken quite appropriate actions and do comply with the law of armed conflict. Every military makes mistakes. The U.S. military certainly makes a lot of mistakes. It's what happens after. Is the IDF a learning organization? Is our military a learning organization? Is there accountability and course correction when mistakes happen? And the assessment right now with Israel is yes. And frankly, even the White House and the State Department determined that in some of the public documentation they've put out. The big challenge now is that the IDF have never had to do stabilization and post-conflict recovery after military operations. This is an entirely new challenge for this military. They didn't do it in Lebanon in the 80s. They didn't do it in Lebanon after 2006. And we've actually seen terrible consequences of what happens and the adversary that fills that governance and security void if you don't have a political vision and a civilian-centric plan for what comes after the big war or the conflict, after the major combat operations. And I think this is precisely the challenge that the IDF face in Gaza right now. They can continue to do big combat operations, but if you don't have a plan for what happens next, this is a terrorist organization. Hamas is a terrorist organization, not a conventional military. There's always going to be more terrorists popping their heads back up. And we're seeing this because the IDF will say they've cleared an area and now they're having to go back in a couple months later. And a big challenge with that is it's not for the military to define the political future of what happens. That's for the political leaders of Israel. And I think our military learned that the hard way in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they don't want to see the IDF squander the battlefield gains that they've achieved since October 7th.
So that's actually a great segue almost to really this question that I really want to understand. You come from the professional military all your life before moving over to the Ministry of Defense. On one hand, you see on the professional level with the United States, this incredible working through problems. Like I remember the Rafah issue was not that long ago in May, June, where people said, look, there's 1.4 million people. You can't start that war there. And the U.S. and Israel worked through it, got 1.4 million civilians out of harm's way. We could debate how they moved to if that was done in the right way, but it was clear that you saved a lot of civilian lives. On one hand, there's a success of the U.S. and Israel working through problems of this war. On the other hand, it seems that the IDF is very hamstrung because the political echelon says, listen, I'm sorry, you can't really plan for the day after in a classic sense because this has political implications of who comes in. Is it the Palestinian Authority? We don't want to say the word Palestinian Authority. And you feel when you meet them that there's this sense of professionally, hey, this is part of our job, which is to plan. So I'm trying to understand that. Where is the U.S. Israel professional relationship on military to military working well? Where is it hamstrung with other limitations? We are seeing something interesting is that the Minister of Defense Minister Gallant, has become like the go-to person for the administration on a lot of issues. because he is seen sometimes by some as the adult in the room that they can work with in working through some of these questions. So I'm just trying to think, what is the wiggle room of the military to solve problems, and where is the military to military relationship constrained because it doesn't have the backing of the political leadership?
Of course, we can talk about it 20 months. What we need now, besides the military dimensions, that we need to defeat them, to kill their commanders, to destroy their units and so on, we need exit strategy. The goal of exit strategy is to destroy Hamas at the end of the day. By the way, Muslim brothers you cannot find in any place in the Middle East besides Turkey. I remember that I used to meet with Field Marshal Sisi, now the president, and I used to ask him, what are you doing with the Muslim brothers? They are entering your armed forces that are much more powerful than Egypt itself. He used to say, I would never give you an answer about Arabs. But at the end of the day, he told me he would put them in jail. Now look at Saudi Arabia, look at UAE, look at Morocco, Tunisia. All of them got rid of Muslim brothers, and Hamas is a Palestinian extension. At the end of the day, we need to destroy them. Now you can do it militarily, but you need to do it strategically. Strategically means that you need alternative to the Palestinians. Alternative to 2.2 million Palestinians is economic one, new Palestinian alternative. I mean, the Palestinian Authority there is no other alternative, but it must be based on the condition of President Biden. They need reform. Reform means that it will take decades. But Saudi Arabia and UAE will not finance any reconstruction of Gaza without the Palestinian Authority. So that's why we need it. There are talks about Dakhlan, about others. I don't want to go to it. There is only one, let's say, trademark that is called the Palestinian Authority. And what we are doing is the West Bank. It's the same. I mean, who is helping us in the West Bank? Judea and Samaria, the Palestinian Authority, by keeping the responsibility over the white civilian areas like education, like health, and so on. So why we cannot do it in Gaza? We need to do it in Gaza. There is no any other alternative. So we need to do it if we want to gain the cooperation with the Arab countries, financing, building new Gaza. Without Hamas, we need combination of the military and the political and strategic and economy. Otherwise, there is no horizon. If there is no horizon, it's despair. Despair means viruses are socialists. They kill Jews and Palestinians at the same time. They don't distinguish. We need to give many solutions. If we finance the budget of having Gaza under military occupation, I was responsible for Gaza twice in my life. It's a burden that is intolerable and it's not logical. That's why we need to join hands with the Arabs. It's an unbelievable opportunity.
There's one idea that the administration certainly wanted to promote, and Israel, the defense establishment, certainly wants to promote, is some understanding with Saudi Arabia. For the United States, it's more of an architecture because it's a U.S.-Saudi defense treaty. For Israel, it would be Saudi-Israeli normalization. As someone who's been, really one of Israel's leading strategic thinkers in Israel for decades, how do you see the value of a breakthrough in this regard between the U.S. and the Saudis, between the Saudis and the Israelis?
Miracle in the Bible, to have the Wahhabiyah center, and they do have my question marks about their responsibility over 2009. I don't want to enter to it. Have normalization with Saudi Arabia under American flag, combined with UAE, Abraham Accords, and the peace with Egypt. It has only advantages. It does not have any shortcoming. It will enhance Israel. It will open bridge between the rising economy of India through Saudi Arabia to Haifa, ports that will collapse because of a surplus of merchandise and so on. It's amazing. We need to do it. There is a sensitive issue of the nuclear that I'm very worried about. That's not the issue. It is the issue, but not for this talk. There is a quantitative military edge, but we do have ways how to handle it. But I think we need to have this alliance, and I understand why Saudi Arabia insists there will be treaty, because treaty is approved by the Senate with 67 senators, unlike the JCPOA that was approved by President Obama, was cancelled by Trump. Another issue, it's something new I haven't shared with you. There is question mark about the role of Egypt behind the supply of weapons to Hamas. If I was now as the Minister of Defense, in spite of my friendship with the Egyptians, I do have doubts and question marks. How come the industry of tunnels, Rafah passage, where it seems to me were open to transferring weapons from outside to Hamas that enables them to build army. This is terror organization, but we have been attacked by army.
Amos was alluding, to be fair, that for the Saudis, it's clear that the normalization piece is instrumentalist because they want a defense treaty with the U.S. that requires 2/3 of the Senate, which is very hard to do. But they see this as a way of winning American support, but they're willing to do it. There's a generational shift in leadership that would have been unthinkable with the previous generation. So how do you see it for an American perspective in terms of how does it shift the way the U.S. looks at the Middle East if it could pull this off?
There is a paradigm shift happening in how the United States thinks about and engages in the Middle East. We have heard for a long time, everyone says, well, you have to pay attention to the Middle East because if you don't, bad things come out of the Middle East and it'll eventually blow back on America. What's happening right now, we have in every Gulf country except one, next generation of leadership. Then you look at the demography of the Middle East. The majority of the citizens of the Middle East are in their 20s and their 30s and their 40s, and they're hungry for global engagement. And they're looking west. They're not looking east. And then you look at what the leaders of the Middle East want. They want emerging technology. They want AI. They want more trade. They want to use their sovereign wealth funds to invest and shape on a global scale. And the question for the United States is, are we going to see the Middle East not just as something engaging in the Middle East to contain problems in the Middle East, but that cooperation and deepening strategic engagement in the Middle East with these partners actually enables us to all work together and have global impact on things that we care about and they should care about. Climate change, renewable energy, food security, the rules-based international order, which benefits us and is benefiting them. This suite of bilateral agreements. There's the discussion about civilian nuclear cooperation between the United States and Saudi Arabia. There's contemplation of a mutual defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. There's also contemplation about other kinds of commitments the Saudis might make to us. And then there's this possibility of normalization with Israel. And the idea here is that it's not just what the United States puts into the Middle East, not just about the United States being a security provider or a security guarantor, but an integrator. And a lot of that work is happening. We've talked about the military operational integration that's happening. We've seen some early models of what integration looks like beyond the security space. That's the Abraham Accords. Amos talked about Morocco, UAE, Bahrain. We started to see demonstrating what this means for the citizens of the region with the Negev Forum, which included Egypt, the United States, and Israel as well, looking at non-security ways of deepening cooperation, education, tourism, public health. And now the Saudis and the potential for normalization with Israel is not only about Saudi Arabia and Israel, it's about Saudi opening the door to the rest of the Arab world and the Muslim world. And that's a strategic game changer, not only for how Israel's security and integration in the region can proceed, but the U.S. vision for a more integrated role. And I should also note here the idea, if you look at NATO, the reason this has worked so well, and one of the reasons Putin is so threatened by NATO expansion, is because when you threaten a country in the NATO alliance, you're not threatening just that country. You're threatening the alliance. So this integration, this enmeshment, when Israel is more integrated in the region, not just security and intelligence, but economy, culture, people traveling back and forth, everyone stands to lose more. And the real loser is those outside that deepening integrated network, and that's Iran. The strategic implications of Iran feeling isolated by what this could achieve, the benefits not only for the governments in Riyadh and in Israel, but for the people and the opportunities there. Also, we know that there's a lot of competition with China, but this is also about showing a positive template of what integration and a U.S. role could be and something that China can't do. global leadership and cooperation on this global scale, a strategic condemnation of what Iran seeks in the Middle East, which is to cultivate and foment instability and coercive leverage. We're offering, by this suite of bilateral and then the multilateral mega deal, a positive vision for normalization that benefits all. It could be an absolute game changer. And I know that the administration really wants to get back to negotiating, which again is why this imperative of getting to a ceasefire in Gaza that has the hostages released can give some space for de-escalation and can start working on the potential for what normalization can bring to the region, to the world, and also to Saudi citizens and Israeli citizens is critical right now.
I want to thank both of you for really covering a lot of ground and really helping our listeners think through all the complexities of the Middle East. Yes, the security threats, but also the opportunities and the balance between those two ideas. How do you both discern the dangers and seize the moment? I want to thank Dana Stroul. I want to thank Amos Gilead. Thank you both for joining us on Decision Points.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much. To see you, it makes my day, because what I can see in the horizon is only gloomy horizon. So you are encouraging me.
Thank you. Thank you both. We just heard an extraordinary conversation with Amos Gilead, really one of Israel's leading strategic thinkers, and Dana Stroul, who has held the key Middle East position at the Pentagon. How do we talk about this crisis that we're in the middle of and put it in a broader context? And as we consider what the U.S. presence and strategy in the Middle East should look like, Iran and other adversaries must believe that the U.S. and Israel are in lockstep. Yet this is a complex balancing act, and we should be candid about that. For Washington to simultaneously support two allies at war, Ukraine and Israel, this has strained U.S. defense production, and the U.S. wants to also avoid a Middle East regional war. At the same time, differences between Israel and the U.S. on key issues are real, and we should not hide this. Defense cooperation is core to the U.S.-Israel relationship, but cooperation at the political level is no less essential. The new threat environment is an unprecedented challenge, but it's also an opportunity to cement a broader Middle East security architecture, one that the U.S. has been developing for years. Yet there's a real chance that the U.S.-Israel security relationship will emerge stronger from this crisis. As we've said before on this podcast, sometimes crisis creates opportunity, and there is here a regional opportunity for much greater cooperation. Thank all of you listeners for another episode of Decision Points. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Sidney Helbush and Gabriel Epstein, as well as intern David Ederberg. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like you for making this podcast possible. Please leave us a 5-star review so we can grow this community. You can find Decision Points on Apple Music, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Download and subscribe to never miss an episode. To our listeners from all over the world, I hope you listen to all of Season 5 of Decision